put us straight on to Wellingtons to see how we could get on from flying Spitfires to Wellingtons.
Dick reflected on his 10 years as a professional jumps jockey and the Grand National that got away.
And just as we're approaching the water jump, you see Devon Lock prick his ears. So I was here last time round, a sign of recognition. As he pricked his ears, this crescendo hit him. God, that's, his hindquarters just refused to act. He went down on his belly and slid along the ground with his 4 feet out in front of him.
The famous author proudly catalogued the numerous injuries he suffered as a jumps jockey.
I broke my nose 5 times. I broke my collarbones 6 times each side, fractured my skull a couple of times, but nothing's prevented me from walking about.
Dick begins part 2 of our story with his recollection of the injury that ended his riding career.
I was riding this horse at a race at Newbury, and he fell with me and hurt my back, my spleen. But it wasn't earth-shattering. I recovered from it all right, but I was advised by Lord Abergavenny, who was the Queen Mother's racing advisor, and I went to see him during my recovery time. He said, if I were you, Dick, I'd get out now while you're at the top. I was leading the jockey's table at the time. He said, you'll get all sorts of things offered you. And I, funnily enough, thought about it for the weekend and talked to Mary about it. And on the Tuesday, they used to have a program on television called Sports View. And I got hold of the producer and I said, if you let me come on, I've got something unusual to tell you. So I went on and I announced my retirement on it. Of course, all the media wanted interviews. What are you going to do, Dick? Are you going to train? I said, no, that's far too worrying. You know, people won't pay and things like that. Had you got a job as a starter? I said I had been offered a job as a starter, but I'd also been offered a job of writing for the Sunday Express. The editor said, would I write half a dozen articles for his newspaper? Those half a dozen articles went on to 16 years.
16 years as a racing correspondent.
Yeah.
But during this period, of course, you wrote your autobiography, entitled The Sport of Queens.
Yeah. I asked Her Majesty's private secretary, Sir Martin Gilliot, I said, do you think Her Majesty will mind me calling it that? And he said he would inquire, and he called me and said, Her Majesty would be delighted if you call it that. And it was based on the first bit, wasn't all chapter 1. The first bit was about the Devon Lock episode, and then I told my life story afterwards.
Now, what inspired you to make the switch from writing racing for a newspaper to writing fiction?
Well, in 1957, my autobiography was published, and it did very well. It came out early in December, but they had to reprint before Christmas. And then but before this, the editor of the Sunday Express had asked me to write articles, and in 1962, about 4 years later, Mary said to me, she said, you always said you were going to write a novel. She said, now's the time. We've got 2 sons to educate, and the cars are beginning to knock, and the carpets are wearing out. So I sat down and wrote Dead Cert, and it was in the contract that I had with Michael Joseph for my autobiography that if I wrote anything else, they must have first refusal. So my agent, my author's agent, took the manuscript of Dead Cert to Michael Joseph, and they published it straight away. And I should have written another one while they were preparing this, but I wouldn't write another until I saw how that had done. So there wasn't one in 1963, and then in 1964 I'd written Nerve. That was published. And in 1965, the publisher said, we want 2 from you this year. We want to get you on the Christmas sale list. I said, I can't do that. I'm writing for the newspaper and I'm writing the 1 novel a year. Oh, yes, you can. You do it. I did 2 in 1965, and there's been one every year ever since.
Yeah, you never took on 2 in 1 year after that?
Well, I did take on 2 in 1985 because I'd been doing the Lester Piggott research for, he wanted me to write his biography. I'd been doing that for about 14 years. In the beginning of 1965, he telephoned, he said, "Dick, I'm giving up in November this year. I'd like my biography out as soon as afterwards as possible." Well, I said, "Lester, you'll have to wait for a while because I've already started Break-In, and I'm going to finish that first." He said, "Well, it's okay as long as mine comes out fairly soon after I give up in November." So I finished Break-In in May. It went into the publishers, and instead of having a break, a holiday, I went straight into doing the Lester Piggott. I'd done a lot of research and facts and figures, and it went, anyhow, his story went to the printers on December the 31st that year, and on January the 1st is when I start my research and writing the next novel, and I hadn't done any research for the new novel, so I used Kit Fielding and Princess Cassilia and Danielle, who'd appeared in Break-In. I used them again in Bolt, and that did well too, so I can't complain.
Lester Piggott has been described by many aficionados as possibly the greatest jockey in the history of professional racing.
Yes, he and Fred Archer and Gordon Richards, but Lester he was big, and he was a genius on horseback. Matter of fact, he was at the Melbourne Cup on Tuesday. I saw him there.
Is he the best jockey you've seen?
Oh, definitely, yes. He rode over hurdles for a couple of years before his job with Noel Merlis started, and I beat him a neck at Sandown over hurdles one day, and I thought, well, I'm doing all right if I can beat Lester a neck.
Yeah. It has been said that he was an extremely impudent
oh, yes,
and cheeky lad.
He would
as a
pin
junior
someone's
jockey.
stick if he dropped his own. And his trouble is he can't talk, you see. He has a great plum in his mouth, and he doesn't hear what you're saying. He's got to be looking at you to read your lips. And I'd done a few years of doing his work, and I said during 1985, when I was bringing his story, which was called Lester, bring it to a head, well, I said, "Lester, of all your Derby winners," there were 9 in the end, I said, "I know you liked Saraiva better than anyone, your second Derby winner." I said, "Tell me all about him." So Lester thought for about 5 minutes. "Nice horse," he said. I had to make a story of that, you see.
That's all he offered. Nice horse.
Nice horse.
Yeah.
But he was a genius on horseback.
Had he been spoiled and pampered from a very early age? Was he
yes.
too used to having his own way?
He had, I think, because his father, for years, I did a lot of research with him. He had films of all Lester's races, all his big races, and he was thrilled with the ground that Lester walked on. He was spoiled, but...
Are you saying he had an ego problem, Dick? Did Lester Piggott have an ego?
No, I don't think he did have an ego problem. But he knew he was good, but I said to him at Flemington on Tuesday, I said, one of my greatest thrills was beating you a neck at Sandown one day. I remember the horse I was riding, a horse called Deal Park, but he said, I don't remember that.
Yeah.
He wouldn't remember being beaten anyhow.
Look at Zadok go, down to the 200. Zadok the leader, a length and a half in front. Ravada on the inside is trying hard, and further back then Vigil, but it's Zadok in front near the line. Ravada's trying hard, but Lester Piggott and Zadok. Zadok wins the Black Oval. Zadok first, Ravada's second.
You know, racing provided the theme for many of your books, but not all. Now, were there occasions you deliberately stayed away from racing?
I didn't stay away from it at all in any of them. I know Trial Run was chiefly about three-day eventing, you know, equestrian world. Mrs. Michael Joseph thought it would be a good idea if I went to Moscow and did some research before the Olympics opened there. And although the main character, what was his name? I've forgotten now, but was a three-day eventer. He had started life as an amateur steeplechase jockey, but it was just at that time that the Jockey Club brought in a rule that jockeys couldn't wear glasses whether they were amateur or professional. So this fellow, he couldn't go with the things you put in your eyes, what they call them.
Contact lenses?
Contact lenses. They didn't suit him at all, so in my story. So he took up eventing, that's why. But he had been a steeplechase jockey, and he went into eventing because of the new rule. But there wasn't much steeplechasing, but there was quite a bit of equestrianism.
Horses were ever present.
And they come into all my books, horses, but not as much in the later novels as in the earlier ones, because I was nearer the scene when I wrote my first book.
Your late wife Mary excelled in the research.
Oh, she loved it. She always said to me.
She lived the role too, didn't she?
Yes, she did. She always said to me, if you ever take up deep sea diving, I'm not going to do any research for that for you.
But she learned to fly.
She learned to fly for fly and
researching.
finish and rat race, and she became a first-class photographer for Reflex. In fact, she became a professional photographer because at that time, Bill Curlin wrote a book about the Queen's horses and the Queen Mother's horses, actually, and Michael Joseph, my publisher, had undertaken to publish this book, and they wanted to use an unusual photograph of the Queen Mother. And they didn't want a press photographer photograph. And they asked Mary whether she would take a photograph of Her Majesty. And Mary said, "Oh, I can't possibly do that, just take a photograph." Oh, they said, "We'll get permission." So Martin Gilliatt, he got permission for Mary to take photographs of her. And one day at Newbury Races, Mary was following her around quite a lot, taking photographs, and the Queen Mother was posing for her even at times. And this photograph appeared on the front of this book of Bill Curlin's, and she got paid for it. So she was a professional. Yeah. She was a professional photographer too, and she learned a lot about pharmacology for Banker. And she and I went to the merchant banks in London, Singer and Friedlanders and Flemings, and they were a terrific help to us, the directors of those banks.
A British author, Graham Lord, suggested in a biography that he did on the life of Dick Francis that Mary was in fact the primary author of your books. Now, that sort of claim must have rocked your fans to their socks.
Absolutely. But fortunately, the book hasn't done very well. He used to work with me on the Sunday Express, and he wrote to me and he said, could he write my biography? And I wrote back, I said, "No, Graham, I'd rather you didn't. I said, "It's a great honour of you to ask, but I'd rather you didn't. If anyone's going to write my biography, it'll be my son, Felix." And he said, oh, that's okay then. And a couple of years later, I found he was writing this biography. And I was furious. if he walked in that door now, although I'm 71, I'd go over and give him a bloody good hiding.
So you totally refute
He was
his
so
claim.
inaccurate. It was inaccurate all the way through. And he loved the idea. Oh, I've got a story. Mary writes the book. Mary, I couldn't have written the book without Mary's help. She corrected all my English, and she did a tremendous lot of research, and we used to discuss what we'd done during the day at night. But and when I wrote my autobiography, Mary read it every word for word, and she said, "You've got a split infinitive here, and have to change that around."
Yeah. So she had the eye of an eagle.
She had a much better eye for reading than I did.
Once your storyline's established and work begins on a new book, do you find yourself chugging along at a steady rate day by day, or are there times when you're bogged down?
I've never really got up, other than a day when I've been bogged down. Sometimes you can't just get it going. But the first page, and the first paragraph especially, takes me a long, long time. You've got to grab your audience on page one, because you see people walk into a bookshop and they pick up a Dick Francis book, or pick up any book, and they go through the pages. And I think if you can grab them on the first page, you can get them for the rest of the book. They have to buy it then.
Are there days when you might be feeling slightly off colour or whatever, that you simply can't face it?
Yes, there are. And I go out, and, well, when I was in lockdown, go out and have a ride around the countryside. But I've never had writers, what do they call it, writer's cramp or something?
Yeah. You've never had that?
I've never had it, not for more than a day.
Have you ever been known to rip a sheet of paper out of a typewriter, scrunch it up and throw it 20 metres?
Yes. What writer hasn't?
Yeah. Now you say to go for a ride brings you back to earth. How long since you've been on a horse?
Oh, it's 10, 12, 15 years now since I've been on a horse. I was about 65.
Yeah. If we had a nice, quiet old gelding in this room right now, would you be tempted to sit on his back?
Oh, I'd get on him, yes. But my last few years as a jockey, I always had this arm strapped down. And I go to bed with it strapped down as well, because if you roll over at night, my shoulder's inclined to go out. Felix, who just walked in, he's got the same trouble, and my father had the same trouble. And I had mine operated on, and Felix has had his operated on. It's a family complaint.
What is your favourite book? Of all of the Dick Francis novels, do you have a personal favourite?
Oh, my favourite, well, until recently it's always been the last one because it's with you. But I think Forfeit was one I really liked. Ty Tyrone was the main character, and he was a Sunday newspaper man, which I was. And Ty had a wife, Elizabeth, and she was a polio victim. She was in an iron lung for a lot of the time. Spirochelle she used to get about. But Mary my wife was in an iron lung with polio. She was in an iron lung for about 5 weeks. She was pregnant at the time too. It was terrible. But I used to race all over England and go back to her hospital in London every night. And that is very much with me. And it was a good story.
What type of book would you tend to read at night before you doze off? What sort of book would you pick up?
I can't read at night somehow. When I get to bed, my head's on the pillow. But if I'm sitting, before I go to bed, if I'm sitting, I like reading biographies or autobiographies. I think the most enjoyable book I've ever read was Charles Lindbergh's book, The Spirit of St. Louis, where he was flying across the Atlantic, the first solo flight across the Atlantic. Oh, it was a super book. And I've got it at home and I sometimes read it again.
Yeah. An amazing feat in 1927.
27 or 28, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
One of those courageous pioneer aviators
Yeah.
that I mentioned earlier. As brave as he wasn't as brave as a jumps jockey.
Oh, I don't know. He was because he was dropping off to sleep and he hadn't slept for hours before he took off. It was an amazing story.
Yeah.
And then afterwards he had a terrible life and his son was kidnapped. And
In an era where sex sells, I think it's a fascinating aspect of your career that you've been able to sell 60 million books around the world without barely a swear word.
No, well, when my sons were at school and I was writing, I didn't want them to be embarrassed what their father had written or so. And now, of course, I never write anything like that because the Queen Mother would hate those. I went into Clarence House to a party she gave some years ago, and she got all my books in a glass case. I'd given them all to her, and it was very rewarding to see. She hadn't got as many then as she has now. And I don't want her to read filthy language, because Martin Gillett used to tell me if she was reading the book and there was something in the book that she didn't like, she'd put a red line underneath it. She said she's had one or two words in your book, which occasionally has the red line underneath it.
Yeah. But isn't it lovely to think that people of many generations still enjoy good, old-fashioned, wholesome adventure?
It is, yes, it is. It's lovely, it really is. And there's so much tripe written these days, isn't there? And I as you said, there are 60, well, my son, an agent, about 5 years ago, they counted up the books around the world at that time, and it was about 70 million. It must be over that now. And they are published in 34 different languages. Not every one, but it's very, very rewarding to have that behind you.
How many more books, Dick? How much longer?
No more.
Is this it?
Yeah. Mary and I, about 15 months ago, when Shattered first came out, Shattered first came out as a hardback and it was very well received. I said, no, we're not going to do any more, are we? And she said, no, all right. She said, I don't feel like doing any more research. And a month after we said that, she died. And I'm not going to do... I'm toying with the idea, I've done a little bit of research, of doing a tribute to her. But that will take a long time because neither of us kept diaries, and you have a lot of checking up to do. But I hope I'll finish it one day.
What if a publisher with a lot of money came along and said, Dick, we want a history of the Grand National?
I'd say, go to someone else.
You sure?
Yeah. I've finished, apart from a tribute to Mary, and it won't be a long book, that.
Do you have a name in mind for that one?
Certainly the reputation of Dick Francis, the author, has eclipsed the memory.
How does Dick Francis want to be remembered? What would you like to see on your epitaph?
Well, it'll be on my epitaph. The chap who didn't win the Grand National, but is probably known a lot better than some of those who did.
Dick, studying your body language and observing your facial expressions when we talk about different topics, it's very clear to me that you gain great delight in reflecting on your literary career, but you absolutely sparkle when you talk about horses and riding jumping horses.
Yes, it was a great life.
It's been the joy of your life, hasn't it?
But the unfortunate part of it wasn't so successful as my writing has been. I had a very successful life as a jockey, But you're limited to about 10 years. My writing has covered 40 years more. And, well, I've had a good life anyhow with both of them.
Dick Francis, on behalf of the 70 million people who've been devouring your books for almost 40 years now, thanks for the fun, thanks for the entertainment, and thanks for gracing the human race with such class and dignity. Look forward to your company next time around on Inside Racing when we introduce another famous face. Until then, many winners.
John Tapp's Inside Racing, brought to you by Mitabite.
Sky Racing at home on the track.
John Tapp's Inside Racing, brought to you by Mitabite.